This video is brought to you by contributions to patreon.com/Henry Kathman from viewers like you. Thank you.
So, it's been a while, huh? Whenever a new year begins, there's always this instinct to look back on the major changes that have happened over the past 12 months. And arguably, one of the biggest frustrations from the last year is a lack of change in a couple of areas. Though out of the many things that I did not expect to happen in 2021, probably the biggest personal surprise was being able to fall in love with the Beatles again. This is partially due to YouTubers like Elliot Roberts and fan projects like the Beatles Rock Band custom tracks, but most of this stems from the latest movies surrounding the band. After being delayed for a year due to COVID-19, 2021 saw the release of The Beatles Get Back, a 3-part documentary series directed and produced by Peter Jackson. While I did have some level of excitement for this project when it was just going to be a single theatrical release, something that I didn't expect is just how emotionally affecting it would be. As watching this movie reawakened a side to myself that had remained dormant for the past couple of years. Though in order to explain why this movie became probably my favorite movie of 2021, I want to give a little background about myself. When I was younger, I really didn't have many opinions about music growing up, as I was raised on this mixture of James Taylor, Jimmy Buffett, and this one weird period of time where my siblings and I listened to a bunch of Christian rock. But during this time, I didn't feel much of a connection to any of these bands. And when I told people that my favorite genre was rock and roll, that concept felt extremely nebulous to me, as I was unable to define what that actually meant. All of this changed when I was in the 6th grade, and my father bought my mother the Beatles' greatest hit album, One, where I immediately began to listen to it on near repeat for much of my time during middle school. This was a time where I was feeling very isolated from other kids my age. And there was this sense of comfort and release that listening to the Beatles music brought to me. In a time where I was dealing with a lot of bullying and uncertainty about myself, listening to this music felt as if I was tapping into this secret gold mine of music that other kids were just too stupid to understand. A reductive and douchey mindset, to be sure, but a mindset that evolved more and more as I became more familiar with the band's library and work. I entered high school in 2009 during the dual release of the Beatles Rock Band and the complete studio remastered box set, where I would meticulously follow the productions of both of these releases, especially the Beatles Rock Band. I would look up crappy recordings of people playing the songs in Best Buys. I would look at interviews between the developers and the producers, and I would watch the opening cinematic to the Beatles Rock Band for what must have been hundreds of times. And that year, I was even lucky enough to see Rain, a Beatles tribute band that was touring through my city, and I even got to play an early version of the Beatles Rock Band before I would later get it that Christmas. During this time, I was a very easy person to give gifts to, because all you had to do was give me something Beatles related, and there was a good chance that I would love it. Some of these gifts included the 2009 remastered box set, t-shirts, posters, and a book of lyrics that my parents bought me when I was 13 that just contains so much nudity, you guys. Like, seriously, Mom, Dad, did you not read through this thing when you bought it for me? I can't even show half of this book on YouTube. Though probably the biggest one of these gifts would be my very first car, a 1985 Volkswagen Vanagon that was just completely broken down. Despite barely running for most of my time owning it, this car has so many good memories tied to it, as it would soon become this symbol of this ideal set by the Beatles, embodying their creativity and freedom, where I would even go so far as to paint the vehicle with song lyrics, portraits, and a yellow submarine. Though as I grew older, eventually I had to sell the van. I would leave for college, I would become more independent, and my love for the band began to fade as my music library was slowly being replaced with video game soundtracks. and this love for the Beatles felt more akin to an adolescent phase, as if the only reason I felt so strongly about this band is that it was the first time I experienced rock music in earnest, causing me to latch onto it with this blind insistence that the Beatles were the best that music had to offer. To me, it felt as though my adolescent self had idolized the Beatles to such a degree that I couldn't really think about them in a nuanced way. So when I heard about the Get Back project, I had a good deal of curiosity for this movie, since we really hadn't had any quality pieces of Beatles media since 2009. But once I sat down to watch through this film, I saw a completely different side of this band that I had rarely even considered. For many, the production of Let It Be, the Beatles' final album and movie, has been enshrined into pop culture as this legendary breakup, as we see the deterioration of the Four's friendship being put to celluloid and vinyl, as these four mates from Liverpool slowly go from brothers and turn to mortal enemies. It was because of the mythology surrounding the Beatles' breakup that Peter Jackson was initially hesitant to take on this project, as he was worried that the footage would be too tumultuous to produce into an enjoyable film. And while watching this movie, this was not the Beatles that I saw. Instead of watching a bunch of bickering enemies, I saw that even in a time when things were considered very tense, the Beatles were just a group of artists that were facing a lot of pressure of having to produce work under a close deadline, all the while having to deal with the expectations to produce something spectacular, not just from the audiences or people like Michael Lindsay Hogg, but also with each other. Through the watching of these 6 hours of film, I saw the ways that each member reacted to this pressure. Ringo would patiently listen to his friends, George would stew in his annoyance and try not to cause problems, John would shut off interest in order to focus on his other ideas, and Paul would try to mediate all of this while still being perhaps the most chaotic member of the group, just climbing on the studio scaffolding and talking about wanting to be arrested. Like a boss. Though perhaps the most striking element to this entire film was how they would casually mention just how old they were getting, like the ways that John was going to be pushing 30 soon, talking about what it's going to be like to play when they're 60 years old. And it made me realize, holy crap, they were all in their 20s when they were the Beatles? I realize this is an obvious fact for some of the most popular music groups, especially those who are marketed to young women, but this was a realization that hadn't entered into my brain until watching this, and it completely recontextualized my entire relationship with the band. For the longest time, the Beatles were these fantastical artists who would produce some of the most influential music and redefined rock and roll through their willingness to experiment and grow. And while this fact remains, this sense of experimentation and growth seems just as defined by the fact that these were four guys who were still trying to figure themselves out while being some of the most famous people in their era. So many of the wild stories that surround the Beatles suddenly make a whole lot more sense when you put it into the context of the kind of person that I was when I was their age. And this is not to excuse some of the absolutely reprehensible things that occurred during that time, though it is indicative of how even in 1969, the Beatles were already feeling stifled by the mythologizing that was already beginning to surround them and their younger selves. The fact that this footage shows the band openly disputing rumors like Yoko Ono's overbearing personalities or the fist fight that supposedly happened between George and John demonstrates how even back then, people would unquestioningly replicate some of the bad faith reads on the band, taking a mythologized version of their younger selves and causing this time period to define a person for the rest of their lives. And over 50 years later, seeing these authentic depictions of the Beatles has caused me to reevaluate some of my relationship with the band. First, they were an escape from a lonely adolescence. Then they were these artistic titans that became a fixation, only to fall away from their pedestals and their quality to be put into question. Though in watching Get Back, the Beatles have now transformed into something completely new for me. Four human beings trying to figure out the best ways to express themselves in a chaotic world. It has been said that it's always a mistake to make gods out of men, but it's equally wrong to make devils. This has certainly been something that I've been grappling with these past couple of years. I think we've all tried to strike a balance between holding people accountable for their shitty behavior while also being able to forgive them when they mess up. But watching Get Back has reminded me of the ways that when you get down to it, nobody knows what they're doing. And we should be able to appreciate the moments of beauty and love that can come despite it all. And as I once again go through the band's discography, I invite you to also think about your own former passions, be they a band, a film, or anything else that you might have fallen off of. You just might be surprised at the ways that it has changed alongside you. But until then, thank you for watching. Best wishes.